Let's talk about the Footprint O3s and the new Footprint O3 center channel. I know there's a lot of questions about how they compare, if the center channels would be a good choice for stereo pairs, bunch of weird questions like that. But I've had the system in here for a few months now, so I've got a pretty good handle on how things sound, and I have some opinions on that. When I was thinking about doing Atmos originally, the original plan was to just go with a much cheaper set of speakers for the 7.1.4 system, and then just stick with my Barefoot MM45s, do most of the mixing on the MM45s, and then start sending stuff out to the Atmos system. So most of my critical choices would be, like I've always done with the stereo pair. And then once I've got, EQs and some basic compression and stuff set, start spreading stuff around the room. My biggest hesitation in doing it that way was because I'm probably approaching Atmos a lot differently than most people. Most people that are utilizing Atmos right now are using it as kind of a remix platform. So you would have a song that's already been done and mixed by an artist in stereo. Then you're taking a bunch of stereo stems out of that session and sending those kind of pre-mixed and processed stems to an Atmos mixer. And then, they're spreading everything out and doing tweaks and everything. So most of the mindsets with Atmos right now are kind of, you're building an Atmos mix based off a stereo mix that's already been done. And you kind of have to really respect that stereo mix when you're sending it out to Atmos and not, do anything drastic to where it sounds totally different. My approach with Atmos is going to be really different. I'm more interested in actually producing and writing and recording things specifically for Atmos and gearing it more towards the kind of acoustic folk bluegrass side of things, where you're using Atmos to create a more realistic picture of a performance and provide space. So with that in mind, and knowing that I was going to approach Atmos differently, I decided that it was going to be really important to me that I had an Atmos speaker system in here that I really trusted, because I didn't want to have to think about it as an afterthought almost. I didn't want to have to start out with stuff in stereo and then start sending it to Atmos and, wondering, well, I don't know how this sounds with these cheaper speakers compared to my nicer MM45s. So that was a big concern. So I just decided at some point that I was just going to bite the bullet and go with a nicer pair of speakers for the Atmos system. Again, I've had my MM45s for a long time. I really love those. Great pair of speakers. So the Footprint O3s seem like a pretty logical choice, because I was hoping that they would be pretty close in sound to the MM45s. I know there's a huge price hike, but at the very least, I figured, well, they'll probably at least sound like they're in the Barefoot family, and it'll be something familiar to the point where I'll have a nice actual three-way speaker system for everything in the Atmos system. And at that point, if, hopefully if they sounded close to the MM45s, it would be something that I knew I could really trust when I started spreading stuff around the room. Because one thing I found with Atmos is that some things that work in stereo do not work in Atmos, and vice versa. So and you can try this at home if you've got a stereo set of speakers. One thing I'd suggest you do is take a mono source like an acoustic guitar, put it right down the center in your stereo pair of monitors, do some EQ and stuff on it, and then literally, if your speakers are here, just turn your head so one of your ears is facing both the speakers as opposed to you hearing it straight on. Even turning your head like that, you'll notice that the tonality and a lot of other things change in that source. And that's exactly what happens in Atmos when you start spreading stuff around a room. The way you might EQ an acoustic guitar when it's in front of you, once you spread it around to your side, it might sound a lot different, and you might make some EQ choices that are totally different when you start moving it to your side. So that's one of those things that I've had to really wrap my mind around and adjust to, because we're so used to this tiny sweet spot that we have in stereo of things always being in front of us. Once you start moving stuff around to the sides and above you and behind you, it's a totally different ball game, and I'm learning that really different. So all that to say, it was important to me that I had a nicer set of three-way speakers that I knew would have enough headroom and that I could trust and would be full range, so that when I was working in Atmos, I felt like I had a system that I could trust. So because I had the MM45s for a while and knew them well, I thought the Footprint 03s would be a good logical step. Thankfully, I found that, you know, there is a difference between the Footprint 03s and my MM45s, obviously. Huge price hike. I notice it much more in the mid-range. There's so much more mid-range clarity and information in the MM45s than there are in the Footprint 03s, but that's to be expected. It's just a totally different price point, obviously. But thankfully, I've been so thankful that the Footprint 03s sound really more or less close to the MM45s. It doesn't sound like you're going to a totally different speaker system or anything. They definitely sound like they're in the same family. Interesting enough, there's two things that stood out to me with the Footprint 03s when I was comparing them to my MM45s. I think having the port on the side of the Footprint 03s was probably the right decision. The low end sounds extremely beefy and punchy on the Footprint 03s. There are some things that I like the low end a little bit better on the Footprint 03s than I do the MM45s. I will say I keep coming back to the fact that the MM45s sound very accurate. They're clinical. I've found the Footprint 03s are a little bit more fun though. Not as clinical or accurate, which is to be expected because of the price point difference, but these are pretty fun. I've started listening to music a lot more on these because I enjoy it a little bit more than the Footprint or the MM45s. The other thing that stood out on the Footprint 03s was the image. You'll see the way I have, because I'm still running a dedicated stereo system with my MM45s and then doing the Atmos system with the Footprint 03s separately. I have the Footprint 03s sitting right on top of my MM45s. So they're pretty much in the exact same sweet spot, exact same location. I've found that the imaging is actually a little bit wider on the Footprint 03s, which was a bit surprising. And I think that has to do with the Spock technology. Let's turn this around real quick. So I feel pretty confident talking about things like outboard gear and microphones. Those are things I know really well. I'm not a huge speaker geek. I don't really geek out on speaker specs that much or anything, but you'll have to read up on how Barefoot does their Spock system. It's kind of dealing with how they handle the crossovers digitally a little bit differently, especially with the higher frequencies. But I had talked to Barefoot about there being, a noticeable difference in the image, and the image actually sounding a little bit wider on the Footprint 03s than it did the MM45s. And they kind of laughed and said, yeah, that's probably Spock. And it sounds like, this is the first one they're using the Spock tech on, but they're planning on kind of gradually rolling that out throughout the line. So I will say there's probably going to be some updates coming at some point in a few years or something, but that Spock tech's pretty impressive. I did notice a wider image in the Footprint 03s. I haven't used it enough yet to say if it's more accurate, maybe, because sometimes when you hear a bigger image in speakers, sometimes it can be an exaggeration and it's not exactly accurate. But I will say that I played around with panning on some stuff and gotten pretty critical on small movements, and I can pick them out a little bit better on the Footprint 03s than I can on the MM45s. So interesting. It'll be cool to see Barefoot roll that out in the next generations whenever that's going to happen. So I'm really happy with the Footprint 03s. They sound similar enough to me from the MM45s to where I didn't feel like there's going to be a huge learning curve moving to the Atmos system. It sounds very familiar to me, and once I had everything set up with SonarWorks, the differences were even smaller because they're trying to get both of those speakers pretty flat. Really happy with the Footprint 03s. Talk about the center channel now. I'll get this out of the way. I don't I've seen a few people already purchasing pairs of the center channels to use as stereo pairs. Having both of them here, I wouldn't recommend that. I think Barefoot has pulled off a minor miracle by being able to make a system that looks really different and just visually and spec wise. This looks different. There's two woofers. It's not ported compared to a single woofer that has a port. That's a huge difference on paper if you're comparing speaker specs, but they sound extremely similar to me, down to the point where, I was hesitant about buying the center channel because right when I was buying the Atmos system from Barefoot, they had mentioned that that was about to come out at NAMM and if I was interested. And I was just really hesitant because I was really fixated on making sure that I had the exact same speaker for every speaker in the Atmos system. That was important to me. So seeing that center channel where all of a sudden they're not porting it and it's got two woofers, I was pretty hesitant to jump into this. But now that I've had it for a month or two and done some mixes and listened to a bunch of stuff in Atmos, this sounds so damn similar to the normal Footprint 03s. I wouldn't worry about it. If you're hesitant because it's different, don't. They're extremely similar speakers. I think the biggest hurdle to get over was just, here, we can turn that around. I mean, obviously you've got a port on the normal Footprint 03s, which is a problem because if you're putting one of these in the center, what side do you put the port on? Do you use the left speaker or the right center speaker? Have the port facing left or right? Big problem. Even here, do I center the tweeter in mid-range and have the woofer off to the side a bit? Do I make this the sweet spot in the middle and split the difference? Do we take the right speaker and put the port up like this to center things more? It creates a lot of problems logistically trying to figure out how to use a speaker like this as a center channel. So I think the biggest thing that Barefoot solved with the center channel was making sure that your tweeter and mid-range were in the sweet spot and they were surrounded by two low-end woofers so that everything is actually balanced visually and aesthetically and just sound-wise. You have a center of the speaker lined up with the tweeter in the mid-range and it's surrounded by two low-end woofers. And I think, since they decided to move to two woofers, that also got around the issue of deciding where to put the port. They just got rid of the port on the center channel. So I think a lot of people are just, they think that maybe since there's two woofers on this and there's no port, it's going to sound a lot more different and there's going to be a lot more headroom. That has not been my experience. I've found that this has the exact same headroom as this does. I've played mono sources going through both these speakers at the same time, turned them up really loud, and I'm noticing that the limiter comes on at the exact same time on both speakers. And as far as the low end goes, this is a very small, tiny, minor thing, but when I'm doing critical listening, I think I prefer the low end on the normal Footprint over the center channel. It sounds a little bit more full and you can actually feel it kind of coming out of that ported speaker side. It makes a difference. The low end's close on this. I think having the two woofers kind of made up for that lack of port more than likely, but man, when I'm really listening critically, I think I like the low end a little bit better on the normal Footprints, and it just feels a little bit more fuller and it's easier to distinguish, some lower frequencies. So I would not recommend, and I don't think Barefoot recommends either, that you think about buying two of the center channels as stereo pairs. You're not going to get more headroom. You're not going to get more low end. And I think there's like a $500 difference between these two. You're not going to save any money. I think it would just be a waste of money. At that point, for $1,500 each, I think that's the same price as the Footprint 02s, the smaller Footprint 01s that have the smaller woofers on the side. So if you're thinking of buying a Footprint O3 that's going to have a little bit more low end for stereo, the two center channel speakers are not the solution. Maybe think about moving up to the Footprint O2s if you want more low end. But yeah, having gotten all that out of the way, really happy with the center channel. Thankfully, it sounds pretty much the same as the normal Footprints. Like I said, there's some small things, but it's so tiny to where I'm not paranoid at all that I'm using a slightly different speaker in the center. I think any of the small differences that I'm hearing between these two speakers is trumped by the fact that, we have a more balanced system here where, your tweeter and mid-range are now centered. You've got two bass, woofers on the side so that your low end's balanced and you're not worrying about a port being on just one side of the speaker like you would with having one of these in the center. So I'm really happy with the Footprint O3s. This Atmos system sounds freaking amazing. I couldn't be happier with it. It sounds great. Again, obviously there's a price difference between the Footprint O3s and the MM45s, but I'm very content. I feel like this is a more than capable Atmos system. It's awesome. I don't ever imagine upgrading at any point. I'm extremely happy with these. And any tiny critical things that I might want to do some checks on, I can always send one of those tracks to the MM45s and do some smaller tweaks and then send it back to Atmos. But so far, I'm not doing that. I've been pretty happy with the Footprint O3s. But yeah. Hopefully that answers some questions comparing the center channel to the normal one. Again, I wouldn't really recommend buying two of these for stereo. Just stick with the normal O3s or move up to the O2s if you need a little bit more low end.